who's Director of Manchester City Galleries and the Whitworth Art Gallery. Please welcome Maria.
I only have one slide, and it's an elephant. This elephant exists. He lived in Bellevue Zoo in Manchester. His name was Maharajah. He was bought in 1871 for £680 from Wombwell's Menagerie in Edinburgh. The plan to transport Maharajah in a train carriage from Edinburgh to Manchester was abandoned after he destroyed the carriage. It was therefore decided that Maharajah and his trainer Lorenzo Lawrence should walk to Manchester, a journey that took them 10 days. He then provided elephant rides to the public for 10 years, until his death from pneumonia in 1882. His skeleton was preserved and it was added to the Garden's Natural History Museum. When that museum was decommissioned in 1941, the skeleton, along with the other exhibits, was transferred to the Manchester Museum, where he lives on as a much-loved feature of the Manchester Gallery. Bellevue, where he lived, had exhibition halls, vast restaurants and banqueting halls, a zoo, gardens, amusement park and a speedway track. At its peak, it had 165 acres and attracted more than 2 million visitors a year. It entertained the masses from 1836 until its final closure in 1987. The whole area is now part of one of the biggest regeneration projects Manchester City Council has ever undertaken to revive the fortunes of the former industrial and working class areas of Beswick and Gorton. Its loss as a physical environment has not dimmed people's fondness for the Bellevue experience. It was the hugely successful main focus for this year's Manchester Histories Festival. Bellevue was characteristic of grand Victorian building ambition. It, along with many grand buildings, town halls, vaulting warehouses, former market buildings, urban houses in parks, grand libraries and glorious swimming baths. The Victorians built a lot, and they built well. Since the inception of the lottery, Heritage Lottery Fund has done remarkable work to restore, reanimate and renew large swathes of our heritage estate. The National Trust likewise has done the same across its property and lands. Local authorities have found amazing and ingenious ways to channel European and regeneration monies into restoring heritage buildings for new uses. English Heritage have been careful guardians of our built heritage, and many, many more people have an active and positive connection with their material and built heritage. But there are still so many buildings to save. And those that were saved in the first phase of Heritage Lottery investment are beginning to realise that the buildings will require ongoing investment at a level the current state of public or even private finances don't allow. We've heard a lot already at this conference about the state of public finances. So what I want to ask is, in the absence of a massive bag of gold that nobody has told us about, what exactly are we prepared to let go? I'd like us to have a different and braver conversation about this, because I picked my elephant carefully. Bellevue and Maharajah are much loved and actively remembered. But Bellevue was razed to the ground. We all know, actually, that you don't always have to have the bricks and mortar for the heritage value to live on. I want to just give you a sense of the challenge that I think we face, even just in Manchester. We are all looking at new futures for Ancoats Dispensary, the Mackie Mayor Building, Heaton Hall, Wythenshawe Hall, Victoria Baths, Upper and Lower Campfield Market, Hume Hippodrome. And that's without even venturing into the Greater Manchester boroughs. I personally think that all of these are amazing buildings with remarkable potential to benefit hugely diverse communities. What I don't know is whether there will ever be the resources to maintain all of them. And this, it seems to me, is the elephant that we're really not talking about. You all know the issues, and I set them out more fully in the provocation essay. They are reduced local authority resources across the board and for the foreseeable future. the constraints and costs of working within a heritage building context, especially when buildings are listed, the difficulty of establishing new business models or philanthropic resources for heritage restoration or for heritage revenue, the tension between community enthusiasm for heritage buildings and viable long-term business models for making the buildings work, and the fact that the Victorian legacy is probably more heritage than we can afford to keep. My provocation isn't saying anything that anyone doesn't know, but it does seem to me we are all complicit in a game of not admitting it is our collective problem. Each party in the complex set of stakeholders that support our built heritage landscape will step up for the things that are their key projects or their strategic priorities, but it is as if that which falls outside their necessary frameworks is going to be picked up by somebody else. And it seems to me that somebody else is Mr. Nobody. Furthermore, which city council or which council member would like to step up to the plate and tell local residents that their heritage building is the one that isn't going to be saved forever? Which leader of a council wants to volunteer to be the one who knocked things down? Except that Bellevue was knocked down, and people mourned for a bit and allowed themselves then to forget and then to begin to remember. Heritage theory is much more sanguine with the issue of forgetting. And it's perhaps useful to remind ourselves that the intellectual debates about memory and forgetting, the complex interplay between social remembering and object worlds, has been thoroughly explored in social anthropology and heritage theory over the past 20 years. We know this stuff, and it doesn't mean that we can decide from our narrow position of the present that a heritage building is not worth keeping. It does mean, however, that we should remind ourselves that all the apparently objective measures of heritage value, from the listing process to conservation management plans to community history websites to preservation societies, are not neutral indicators of fixed and never-changing importance of heritage assets. A more acute and nuanced awareness of this in practice would mean that we might be able to open up consideration of the value of the past to more searching questions about how an asset is going to find a sustainable value in the future. This is a question and a provocation for now, for at least two reasons. The first is, as we have already said at this conference, the present pressures on public funding for heritage, particularly within local authority contexts, mean that there's a pressing need for this braver conversation, where heritage professionals, heritage funders, local authority staff and heritage enthusiasts need to work together. We have collectively got to look at the size of the elephant. The second is that 150 years on from the heyday of the Industrial Revolution and the Victorians' Grand Building Programme, our heritage system is constipated. There are too many buildings that are valued and loved, sometimes by many people, sometimes only by a few. There are too many important buildings for us to continue to operate with the systems of value that have borne us forward to date. This is implicit in our heritage theory and in our heritage policy very often. It's not always applied in our heritage practice. We all know that there's an elephant in the room, but like the other apocryphal elephant, that one that's described by the blind men, we all only see our bit, rather than taking our blinkers off and facing the scale of the problem. So I want to see some new actions towards a no-blame conversation about letting some things change and even letting some things go. As a heritage colleague of mine reminded me recently, all conservation is entropic. It is the management of decline. So we should think about where and when we might choose to take our foot off the brake and hasten the decline of some heritage assets in the service of maintaining those with the strongest case for a heritage future. So I want to close by some suggestions towards what a new culture of care for our future heritage assets might entail. The first would be greater sense of place-based decision-making. Jenny Abramsky flagged this up already yesterday, and it'll be picked up by Sir Howard Bernstein in his talk later. You'd think this was in place, We have strategic plans for culture, arts, heritage, visitor economy. We've got local cultural partnerships, local economic partnerships, community plans. All of these, in theory, should allow heritage decisions to take account of place-based need. But in my experience, they don't really, except for a few brave conversations between individuals. Because the culture and behaviours that we require to face really difficult problems aren't there yet. So I want to see a new frankness animating cross-sectoral conversations about what can and can't be done. New business models. We've heard a lot about that already today. These are important, whether they are new business models for heritage assets as social enterprises or community assets. They all hold promise, but please God, can we have some collective new realism about the limited amount of revenue support they can achieve. Likewise, new philanthropy, endowments, and so on. If these other forms of funding were going to yield enough money to run all the heritage assets that they are proposed for, I think it would have happened already. No one's been sitting on their hands for the last 10 years, and it's important that while we explore them, we don't delude themselves that they are the hidden solution that none of us had realised to date. We've got to grasp the mettle on whether the preservation of heritage, through things like listing, helps or is at odds with preserving it for future use. Again, whether this is new community use or new economic use for buildings. At a high level, the right flexibility is already in place. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone, least of all English heritage. But how this flexibility is applied on the ground is highly variable, and we need urgently to ensure there are a consistent set of behaviours that embrace collective problem solving and flexibility. We also need to start training professionals towards letting things go, actively forgetting things. This applies not just to buildings, but even more acutely to heritage collections up and down the land. We have frameworks for disposal and deaccessioning, just as we have flexibility to alter listed buildings for future use. But nothing much really happens. Nick Merriman, sitting there, 7 years ago gave a Museums Association keynote address about the need to forget parts of our collections. And everybody agreed with what he said, and hardly anything has happened. Even in our own institutions, where we really want it to happen. It is enormously time-consuming to undergo disposals processes. It's time-intensive, and also there is a professional disinclination to let things go. The need to keep is so strong in the profession that it's getting in the way of understanding the idiosyncratic, non-rational way the heritage estate has accumulated over the past 2 centuries. And we need to change that. What goes with this is the need for an acceptance that in some cases, choosing to let an asset for which a new use cannot be found might be better than seeing it mothballed and sitting as our bricks and mortar elephant in the room. I don't think anyone in this room who has to examine the terrifically difficult choices that have to be made by funders, local authorities, heritage custodians, both public and private, will disagree with what I'm saying. But I am equally certain that no one alone will want to stand up and start to make the hard choices. We need instead to join hands on this, to initiate a different kind of conversation and different kinds of professional behaviours that would accept our collective responsibility for letting go as well as saving heritage. And we need to initiate this as a new kind of conversation with our publics about the future of heritage. Thank you.
Okay, and last but not least of what I think you'll agree already turning into an incredibly stimulating first session for the day